All right, we're at the top of the hour. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to the Division of Perceptual Studies webinar, introducing the work we do in the Ray Westphal Neuroimaging Lab. My name is Melanie Smith, and I help manage communications for the division, also known as DOPS, which was founded in 1967 by Dr. Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia. So DOPS is the most productive and longest running university-based research group in the world devoted to the rigorous evaluation of empirical evidence for extraordinary human experiences and capacities. Our work extends beyond scientific investigation to include exploration of the ongoing impact of this research on people today and implications for scientific theory. You can learn more about our mission and efforts on our website, www.uvadops.org. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from one of our new faculty members, Dr. David Acunzo, Assistant Professor of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences in the University of Virginia School of Medicine. After a degree in telecommunications engineering from IMT Atlantique in France, David obtained his PhD in neuroinformatics from the University of Edinburgh and then held research positions at the Center for Brain and Mind Scientists at the University of Trento in Italy and at the Center for Human Brain Health at the University of Birmingham in the UK. He has worked on a diverse array of cognitive neuroscience topics, including vision, attention, and semantic processing, using various computational and functional neuroimaging techniques, including EEG, MEG, and fMRI. David's current research interests include abnormal perceptions, response to hypnotic suggestion, and extraordinary experiences, including mystical and psi experiences. Here at DOPS since last November, he recently became director of our Ray Westphal Neuroimaging Lab. We are delighted to have him on the team at DOPS and with us here tonight to share our work on psi phenomena and the brain. And during the webinar tonight, you can use the QA function on your screen to submit questions at any time for Dr. Acunzo, who will speak for about 40 minutes, and then take as many questions as we have time for before we wrap up at 9 p.m. Eastern. And now, without further ado, I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. David Acunzo.
Thank you, Melanie, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here on this late hour or very early, depending on where you are. So today I will talk about the work that we do at the Neuroimaging Lab, and I want to talk about more generally about the approach that we're taking. I hope that at the end of the webinar, you will understand what we do, and in particular, the general approach and its rationale. I'd like you to, in the end, you tell yourself, okay, it's interesting what they're doing, and it makes sense the way they approach the subject. A few topics we'll touch upon, what are psi experiences and why they are interesting to study. How is psi typically studied in a laboratory setting, and what is specific in our approach at DOPS, and why is it specific, right? So I'm going to try as much as possible to put our research into a wider context. I'm not going to go into very many details. I'm not going to talk about specific papers. Maybe I'll disappoint you, but I won't talk a lot about the brain itself. I want to have a broad view so that you understand why we do things the way we do. So Melanie touched upon this already, but I'm going to reiterate, and that will put things into context as well for what we do in the lab. What do we study at DOPS? We're investigating the mind's relationship to the body, right? And the possibility of consciousness surviving physical death. And for this, we study phenomena that challenge the mainstream scientific paradigms regarding the nature of human consciousness. I will briefly explain what that means, the mainstream scientific paradigm. But so the type of phenomena that challenge this scientific paradigm, they include the cases of reincarnation type, so those children who say they have memories of past lives, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, mediumship phenomena, or the psychic phenomena. Right? So this is the type of phenomena that we are generally interested in studying at DOPS. Historically, DOPS has been mainly focusing on spontaneous experiences and therefore using methods that use questionnaires or field investigations. And that stems from the founder of DOPS, Ian Stevenson, who was focusing on court, those children who remember past lives. And that was taken afterwards by Jim. So you can see a picture visiting, so doing a field study. He's going to see the families and doing interviews. And then Bruce Grayson joined and studied NDEs, so near-death experiences, which is also something you cannot really study in a lab. So you have to go through interviews and questionnaires to try and understand those experiences. DOPS also has a clinical arm with Kim Pemberthy in particular, works on theory and philosophy. What are the implications of those phenomena? This is spearheaded by Ed Kelly, who wrote this very influential book, Irreducible Mind, and got an award from the Society for Psychical Research for this work. And finally, we have a laboratory-based arm to do experimental research. And that laboratory was founded by Ed and co-directed by Ed Kelly and Ross Dunseith until 2 weeks ago, where I became director of that lab. So I'm going to talk about more this aspect, the laboratory-based aspect, but also how it fits with the more spontaneous experiences. So before I start talking about the lab, I want to talk about the object of study, which is psi, which are also called psychic experiences. There are two broad categories of psi experiences. The first one is extrasensory perception, which is the acquisition of information without the normal physical senses. It includes precognition, getting information about the future, clairvoyance, getting information about events or objects, and telepathy, getting information about people or thoughts. Sometimes those categories, they're a bit blurry when you have an event. Sometimes it's a bit difficult to know if it's clairvoyance or telepathy or even precognition, or even between the two main categories, between extrasensory perception and PK that I will talk about. So this categorization has some limits, but it's a very useful way of seeing things. I'm just going to give an example of a spontaneous extrasensory perception, just so that we understand, because we start from things that we observe in the real world, to be able to then isolate them into a laboratory. So I want you to start, so I want to introduce that talk by talking about those spontaneous experiences that happen in the wild, right? So this case was reported by Louisa Ryan, who was a researcher who was specializing into those the study of those reports of spontaneous cases. And this case reads like this: my husband was drafted into the Marine Corps. We had been married for 3 months, and of course we were very close. I stayed at my mother's house several nights a week, as I was lonely. On this Friday night, I fell asleep, and at about 1:30 a.m., I woke up, and Richard, my husband, was standing in the room next to me. It was clear as this paper, meaning probably the paper she was writing on. He didn't speak, but just stood there as if sort of pleading. When I got up the next morning, I told my mother I was very worried something might be wrong. I didn't hear from him that day, but the next day I received a phone call from the Navy hospital. He had pneumonia. At the time he appeared to me on the Friday night, he was standing 12 to 4 fire watch. When he complained of being sick, they thought he was trying to plead out of fire watch, and he was forced to stand it anyway. He had a fever of over 104 Fahrenheit, 40 degrees for people who don't use Fahrenheit, and was very sick. And at those moments when he appeared to me, he told me that he was walking the watch, just praying so hard that he could be home with me. So this is quite a typical case, typical in several respects. The first is that it's probably an experience that was sleep related, because it was early in the morning or late at night. She was just asleep. So probably a sleep-related experience, and I'll talk about Alzheimer's test of consciousness and how they are related to these kind of experiences. It's probably a telepathic experience, and it has an apparition. So she sees with her senses a type of hallucination, but she makes the link with the real event. And that's the ESP part, that's the extrasensory perception. The psychic part is that she makes that link between the experience that she has and a real event. The other broad category of psychic experiences is psychokinesis, which is the influence of the mind on matter without the non-physical means. Examples are psychic healing or cases of poltergeist, which are cases that are very controversial and they make a lot of noise. They usually involve the community around, and they may involve the press, and they have different features: the movement of objects, materializations, noises, electrical disturbances, etc. Right, so those are examples of the two broad categories of psychic experiences. And there are two ways you can look at those experiences. They can be spontaneous, and they can be induced or intentional. Right, so if you want to induce those experiences, people can buy a Ouija board, for instance, and they can play to call spirits, and maybe they will experience that the planchette, the little cursor, heart-shaped cursor, will move by itself. They may experience PK, and if they write using the planchette messages, and they get information that they shouldn't have by normal means, then that would be ESP. People organize parties, spoon bending parties, where they try to influence with their mind. They try to bend spoons. So there's a sort of game element, social element to those experiences as well. So those are examples, again, of induced or intentional experiences. And very part of our culture as well is mediums, healers, so people who live from that profession, psychic healers, psychics in general, giving advice, providing advice, or to the communities. So it's very much part of our culture. And of course, you have the very famous cases going on TV. Uri Geller on the left, who was very prolific at bending spoons, apparently, and nowadays we have Tyler Henry, who has a Netflix show, right? So it's really part of our culture, part of our folklore, but is very little studied. Very often, these experiences are associated with altered states. So I talked about so the example that I gave earlier, that person that saw her husband during the night, it probably is associated with it can be seen as a sleep-related experience, probably. Sleep paralysis is an example of exceptional experience where people often, not well, of course, but they may report ESP experiences. Another example of altered states associated with Psi is the phenomenon of somnambulism that was very popular in the end of the 18th century. It was a precursor to hypnosis, and so this person, the Marquis de Puységur, was inducing those states where the patients, because there were patients, could generate a whole range of Psi experiences. And we know that oracles, mediums, shamans tend to use different methods to put themselves in a trance. So they may use sensory stimulation, they may use drugs, they may use movement such as dancing, singing, drumming, etc., to get into those states. And within those states, they have visions that will help them giving the information, this anomalous information, right? So through our history across cultures, these reported Psi experiences tend to be, not always, of course, associated with altered states, whether they are spontaneous or whether they are induced. Altered states is a not very well defined term. Actually, it's very poorly defined. It includes any normal any state that is distinct from a normal waking state and characterized by changes in perception and awareness, and it includes many different states: dreaming, meditation, hypnosis, trance, daydreaming, even spiritual or psychedelic experiences would fall into that very broad category of altered state. But what's important to remember is that they're typically associated with anomalous experiences, and in particular, psi experiences. Okay, so now we know what psi experiences are, why they're interesting. So as I said, they are very common the parts of human experience. They are in our culture, they're in the folklore, and about half of the population reports spontaneous psi experiences occurring at least sometimes. And when they occur, they may have a very lasting impact on people, right? So because they are part of human experience, I think they are worth studying by themselves, right? Another aspect is that they're very informative on how perception, the mind, and the brain functions. Even if you don't take into account the fact that the veridicality aspect, meaning the fact that the psi experience is real, just the fact that, for instance, that person saw her husband had this type of hallucination is interesting in itself, right? It tells us about perception and the mind, and the fact that she made that link between a real event and her perception is also interesting to study by itself. It may tell us about inference, the causal and effect link that we make in our mind between subjective experiences and real events. But another aspect that's very interesting to me is, well, we can say all those experiences are just coincidences. There are cognitive biases. There may be fraud, in particular when we think of those very big cases in the media. But is there anything to it? Is there anything really real? Is there something that really exists in there? And that's an interesting question, sort of high risk, high reward type of question, because if they are real, if psi experiences are real, they constitute anomalies under the dominant scientific view, right? Because they are anomalies, they could revolutionize our understanding of the mind-brain relationship and of the physical world, which goes back to the mission of DOPS, right? But what is this current understanding? The dominant view is that everything around us, and everything in the world, basically, including our perception, including our minds, and including our consciousness, is reducible to molecules and atoms and physical-chemical processes. If I see an apple, it's because there are photons that were reflected, electromagnetic waves reflected on the apple, stimulating receptors on my retina that are then transduced into neural activity, and all this activity is generating the percept of the apple. And this is reducible to a set of neurons, right? Activity of neurons, and the neurons are constituted of molecules and a bunch of neurotransmitters working with receptors. And basically the current view is that, or the dominant view is that the mind and consciousness is reducible to a set of local physical chemical processes. Local meaning within the brain, which would contradict that idea of information going from a distant event or a future event, right? So this model leaves no room to psi experiences as I presented. So if psi experiences are real, then this model has to be revised, and that's by itself a scientific, that would constitute a scientific revolution. So how do we study psi experimentally? If we're interested in isolating those phenomena in a lab to study them, how do we approach that? So you can't really work with spontaneous experiences because by definition, they're uncontrolled. They can happen at any time, in any circumstance. You can't really work with that. So you need to induce them somehow, in one way or another. One approach is to study people who claim to have psychic abilities, or to claim to be able to generate them more or less on demand. Another approach is to study those altered states, because we know they are associated with psychic experiences. If we study altered states that may be associated with psi, maybe we'll understand better what psi is and how it works. And that's the approach that we favor at the lab, is to study people who claim to have psychic abilities and or who can get into those altered states. An experimental protocol and an analysis design has to rule out any normal explanation for the observed phenomena, right? Because psi is defined as transmission of information or modification of events without the normal physical means. You need to rule out all those normal physical means. So you have to work on getting rid of any physical sensory leak, making sure that all your randomization is very well done, making sure that there's no cognitive biases in the way the subjects respond, or you need to account for that. And then, of course, like any other experiment in any field, you want to try and reduce as much as you can experimental bias, cherry picking, statistical bias, etc. But those are the two sort of sine qua non conditions for observing or studying psi. So how do we do it? A bit more concretely, I'm going to give examples of two canonical paradigms of ESP. Sorry, two canonical paradigms of psychic, of psi, one of ESP and one for PK. So the first one is the Gansfeld, very famous paradigm in very classical paradigm, where you put a participant in a chamber. It's not a sensory isolation chamber, but it's a bit like that, where they're very comfortably lying down or very comfortably sitting up, and they will have earphones playing static noise, usually white noise or pink noise, and they will have half ping pong balls on each eye, and they will have a light shining, a red light often, so that they'd see red or pink, or the whole visual field will be red or pink, and they'll hear noise, just static noise. And after a few minutes, with some preparation, they will start drifting and have very vivid imagery, maybe hearing things. So this is a way to try and induce such altered states. And the ESP part is that there would be a target image in a different room. And the idea is to ask the participant to try and describe that target while being in that altered state. And you want to, again, to shield that target. So you make sure that no one sees the target during the experiment, or if there's someone in the room, you want no one else to be in contact with that person seeing the target. And so during the Gansfeld, the participant would describe what they experience. I see an animal, I see a sausage, and whatever. And after that, there will be either that participant or a judge that would be presented with the target and decoys. And the idea is to try and choose the image that would correspond the most to that description. And if the chosen image is the target, that would be a hit, and you'd say, oh, that would show that psi is true, or psi occurred in this case. But the thing is that you have a 20% chance of being accurate, of course. So to be able to infer that psi is there or happens, you need to do many repetitions. And you need to show that there is a statistically significant departure from chance, and then, only then, you can infer that psi happened, maybe, if you're sure that all your shielding, all your design, your analysis is sound. So this is a typical paradigm. Very quickly, the PK paradigm, the sort of canonical paradigm that people have been using. Then very few people, I think, scientists, I haven't read actually any paper of scientists trying to look at people bending spoons. what people have been using is random event generators. So they look at a system that is random, that's using they're usually electronic devices that generate real noise, real random events that are then binarized, and then those this binary sequence would be transformed into a visual or any other feedback. Could be sound, could be visual, and then the participant would be asked to influence that feedback, and that would then influence the occurrence of, or the proportion of ones and zeros. So they'd be asked to generate more ones, and then in another condition they'll be asked to generate more zeros, and maybe you'll have a baseline. But again, like before, you need many repetitions to detect a departure from chance, and psi is inferred statistically after those many repetitions. So just to recapitulate, so during an experiment, so psi experiments, you'll have a participant and a target, and you want that physical shield because psi is a, say, non-physical, or you want to rule out any normal physical explanation. In the case of PK, you asked, or the idea is that the participant will influence events, so would influence the target, and the case of ESP, the participant would get information about the target. But so over many repetitions, you may observe a statistical deviation. And if you observe a statistical deviation, you may infer that psi occurred. And that's the main approach that people have been using to test for psi. The thing is that because there is no model, physical, let's say there's no model to account for psi, there's no really explanation. Psi is basically defined as a statistical deviation in the experimental context. We don't have a model that can account for that. So it hasn't resolved really the debates, because the critics always consider that, oh, maybe there's a bias somewhere that exists. So can we do better than that? Can we go a bit further? And that's the approach that we're taking in the lab, is to focus on the state of the participants. And there are at least two ways we can do that. One is to look at their subjective and first-person aspects. And here I'm talking about this is the approach that we're taking in the lab, that maybe departs a bit more than the more canonical experiments that are being done in that field. So one aspect is focusing on the first person, also called the phenomenology. What do people experience during those psi experiences in the lab? And you have different methods, questionnaires, interviews that you can do during the experiment, after the experience, of course. And the other way is to try and objectify that state using observations, sort of more objective observations, and you can use, in particular, neurophysiological measurements, including neuroimaging. And I think that by if we have those three aspects, trying to if we have a statistical deviation that we may infer that it's psi, that we can associate with a particular features of a subjective experience, and or with particular neural signature, then that would make that would strengthen the case for psi, if there is psi occurring, and that makes it much more interesting. So just to make things really clear, I'm going to say the same thing, but maybe in a bit different way. We have three elements. We have the psi aspect of the experiments. We have the measurements of the neural activity, and we have the measurements of the subjective experience. And we can study, for instance, the neural correlates of psi occurrence in the lab. You can study the subjective states associated with the psi performance. If you don't have psi occurring, or if we find out that psi doesn't exist, for instance, it's still very interesting to study the subjective experiences associated with neural activity. It's a very, we can learn a great deal about that. And you can study the three together. That would be the neurophenomenological study of psi experiences in the lab. So the lab, I've been talking about the lab, but so what is the lab? So we have a very nice, flexible state-of-the-art neuroimaging suite at DOPS. We have a Faraday cage. That's this metal booth here where we can put participants. We also have a satellite room in the upper floor across the hall that would allow us to have, say, for instance, telepathy experiments where we have this very robust sensory shielding. We can carry out computer-controlled experiments, fully computer-controlled experiments where we can have behavioral measurements, a bunch of physiological measures, including EEG, including FNIRS. I'm going to quickly explain what those are. And we can also do PK experiments because we have REG, random event generators. So as I said, we can measure EEG. EEG measures the brain activity, the electrical activity on the scalp generated by neural activity. It's quite user-friendly. You can, it's minimally invasive. It doesn't hurt. It's super safe. So it's a great tool. And we also have an FNIR system, which is instead of measuring electrical activity, it measures the oxygenation of blood by shining infrared light, near infrared lights, and that measures the amount of oxygen you have in the blood. It's more robust to movement. It's also very user-friendly. It doesn't hurt, and it's minimally invasive. I'm going to give a few examples of projects that are under development or initiated. So we have a few psi-related projects that include or not outer states. We have data that we've inherited from before I arrived from an exceptional individual doing an ESP task. So they didn't have images, but the participant had to locate a location, to guess a location on a screen. And then we have a remote viewing experiment and an out-of-body experience experiment that I'm going to detail a bit more just after. And we have a few outer states of consciousness projects, one on EMDR-induced after-death communication, again, looking at neural activity and phenomenology. One project on self-induced Kundalini and spiritual experiences, and another one on hypnotically induced mystical experiences. And another project that would be an extension of the court investigations, but involving the lab, looking at the neurocognitive aspects of those children who claim to remember past lives, and maybe the adults after when they reach adulthood. Couple of examples of projects that I'm very excited about. So with Marina Weiler, who's the PI on that project, we're going to go to Brazil at Foz do Iguaçu. There is a conference happening at the IIPC, which is a institute that trains people to generate out-of-body experiences, which are an altered state of consciousness whereby people feel that their spirit leaves their body. It's also called astral projection. And what we're going to do is that we're going to measure the brain activity while people are generating these experiences. So we'll take people who are experts in generating those experiences. So we have people who can control them, so we can better study it. And we'll have a battery of questionnaires and phenomenological interviews so that we can understand their subjective experience in very much detail. And because there are anecdotal cases of people visiting other places throughout those out-of-body experiences and giving information about distant places, then we also will have add a little twist to the experiments, and we'll have an image target, very much like the Gansfeld experiment that I mentioned. So we have those three elements that I was talking about: the subjective experience that we look at, the EEG and physiological measures, the objective measurements, and the ESP aspect so we have those three elements, and we'll try to find if there's links between the three. The other project that I'm very excited about, it's also with Marina Weiler, is a study of remote viewers. You may have heard of remote viewers. They are because the U.S. military use psychic spies using remote viewers in the 80s and 90s in particular, and you have this very famous remote viewer, and there's documentaries about remote viewing and even a movie, I think. But in any case, there are people after that program or that part of the program shut down. Some psychics or trainers started teaching these methods in the civil society. So we have access to people who use this very standardized method of being psychic. It's a type of being. There are psychics basically, but they use a very specific method. And there's also an association, the International Remote Viewing Association. So that gives access to people who use this specific method. That's very good for us as scientists. And we had actually someone from IRVA who came for a pilot just to see how we can approach that subject and the object of study. And same, so we had the participants hooked up to the EEG while they were so for this pilot experiments we had we just put targets into envelopes, and they were trying to describe what was in these envelopes, and they were doing what they usually do, sketching and writing and talking about what they experience. And then we'd have a phenological interview to try and understand in more detail what they experienced, and then we'd have the feedback. So that was the target, and we debrief. So the idea is to have a full-on experiment, tightly controlled, looking at remote viewers. So to conclude, just as a conclusion, I'm going to repeat myself, but it's always good to repeat things when you talk. So psi-related experiences are common in the general population. They are interesting because they are part of our culture. They are part of human experience. Their veridicality, meaning the fact that they are real. So the veridicality aspect is controversial, but if it is confirmed, it has huge theoretical implications. Veridical psi can be tested in laboratory setting using repetitions, statistical inference, as I explained. And in the laboratory at DOPS, what we try to do is to study first-person reports as well as neurophysiological recordings in selected participants to better understand psi phenomena and outer state of consciousness as well. I'd like to thank you for attending, and I would like to thank all my colleagues at DOPS, Maggie for organizing the webinar, and Melanie for introducing. And I'd like to thank the lab supporters, in particular Ray Westphal, that helped. Without whom we wouldn't have a lab at all. So thank you again for attending, and I hope you enjoyed the talk and you learned a couple of things at least. And I'll be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thanks, David. We've got a lot of questions. I want everyone to know that if you submitted a question, I might paraphrase it, and I might group some similar questions together and try to get into general topics to ask David. David, we've had a couple people ask about your personal connection to psi phenomenon and what brought you to study this. Would you feel comfortable sharing with us how you got interested in this and steered your career this way?
Yeah, so it's purely an intellectual interest. I mean, I've had maybe a couple of experiences that could be psi experiences, but it's really when I was a teenager, my mother was interested in this kind of topics, and she had a book lying around, which was Richard Broughton's book called Parapsychology: A Controversial Science, which talked about those scientists studying those topics that were extremely controversial, and how and they were explaining, well, kind of what I've been explaining here actually. how they were doing things, and how the scientific community would dismiss this kind of work. And I was fascinated by the fact that that it was so controversial to study that, regardless of the reality of those phenomena, because I think there's no topic that should fall outside science, really. I mean, you can think that what we do is stupid, but you can, let's say, acknowledge that, okay, maybe it's still worth investigating, even though I think that it's stupid. So because I think science is also a political thing, because it's a social thing, but you try to challenge common ideas, right? That's the purpose of science. If we just study things that are accepted, there's not much point of doing science. So my personal interest is really more intellectual. I didn't have a near-death experience or something like that. It's way more boring. Sorry.
Thank you for that. Okay, we have, someone says they saw you're going to be speaking at the IRVA conference in November. Can you tell us or give us a hint about what your topic is going to be at the conference?
Yes, yes, I can. So I'll be talking about this basically. I'll be talking about that, about the remote viewing project that we currently starting, and I hope that I'll have more to talk about. So yeah, that will be the topic. How to um, link remote viewing with well, how to approach remote viewing using this method that I explained, linking the subjective aspect, the neurophysiological aspect. And I hope that by the time we at the ARVA conference, we'll have more data, and I can talk a bit more detail about have some primary results.
Great. Okay, and I think you can answer this question, but if you can't, I might ask Maggie. But there's a couple people who are interested in our relationship with the Monroe Institute, and if we've done collaborative studies with them, and where, if we work with them at all, and where we intersect. Can you speak to that, David?
How it intersects?
Yeah, how much do we collaborate with the Monroe Institute and our relationship with them?
Yeah, so Ross, who works at the lab as well, also works at the Monroe Institute. So we already have this kind of link. Some participants in the past have been participants in lab experiments here, because they were found through TMI, through the Monroe Institute. So that's one way of collaborating. We don't have formal collaboration. I mean, I don't have formal collaboration yet with the Monroe Institute for specific projects, but I'm totally open to that. I mean, the study of altered states in particular, through the sound stimulation is very fascinating. I think there's definitely room for collaborating with the Monroe Institute. Yeah.
Great. What are the qualifications for someone to be part of research at the lab? How do you find people to participate?
As participants or as helping to do work?
I think study subjects, I think is what
Yeah.
they are asking.
Yeah, so the subjects, so for instance, in the two projects that I talked about, we have institutions that basically vouch for participants. So those participants are trained using specific methods, using meditation, visualization, and Marina has a link with that institution, and they pre-selected some participants, and Marina is actually interviewing them to see if they are confident in being able to generate those experiences. For the remote viewing experiments, we will probably go through IRVA as well. The people who have those kind of experiences, they're usually very motivated because they're very curious about what's happening. To them, they are they're very common, but at the same time, because it's not that common in the general population. They are curious about it, and they want to, and often they want also to spread the word about those experiences. So they are very willing to participate in experiments. And sometimes people reach out to us. They just write to us and say, hey, I can experience this. I can generate this experience. I can generate a spiritual experience on demand. So people reach out to us, and then we decide whether it would be interesting to study or not. So different ways. There are different paths to be a participant in our experiments.
Okay, we have a question here about the phenomenon of seeing while blindfolded. And if we've ever taken an interest in that or study that, sometimes it's called extraocular vision, but it might be under other names as well. Do you have any experience with that?
I do not. I do not have experiences with that. What I know about that is that, so remember I talked about this Le Marquis de Puységur, this very early mesmerist who was inducing those somnambulist states in the end of the 18th century. One of the phenomena that was generated within that state was extraocular vision. It was one of the, and it was part of the battery of tests that was done in front of the French Academy of Science to decide whether these phenomena were real or not. So for me, that would fall within ESP probably, although some people I think consider that there might be some receptors maybe on the skin that would allow for extraocular vision. But yeah, I don't know. I haven't read a great deal about it. I don't know much about it, so I don't want to say too much about it.
Okay, understandable. Okay, so the Gansfeld experiment that you mentioned, does those experiments or any others that you know of ever study the olfactory component? Since smell is one of the most memorable of our senses, is there a way to incorporate that into the studies?
I think so. So if when you study the phenomenology of those experiences, right? So if someone is in a Gansfeld, for instance, or doing remote viewing, let me go back to this. Yeah, doing remote viewing, for instance, or trying to get a target, they may have sensory experiences. So they may see things, they may hear things, they may smell things, they may have tactile sensations, they may have very strong feeling that something exists, or that's the target. I know that's the target, for instance. But so they may have a whole array of sensory experiences, including olfactory experiences or taste as well. So I think through the study of the phenomenology, we can study that. So I don't know if that person who has the question was wondering whether we could have olfactory targets. I mean, that why not? The difficulty with olfactory targets is that I mean, people do that in neuroscience. There's a in cognitive neuroscience, people do use olfactory targets or olfactory stimulation, but it's just a bit cumbersome. It's much easier to display something on a screen, right? Or to play a sound than to have a machine that generates smells. It's complicated. It's more difficult to control. It's probably, I don't know how much it costs, but it's a bit more cumbersome. So that's also why I think it hasn't been very studied. But it's possible. Yeah, we could do it, of course.
Okay, at the lab, do we have access to fMRI and TMS or transcranial magnetic stimulation? Do we have those resources available to us?
So we don't have TMS. We just don't have the equipment. We don't have an fMRI for ourselves, but there is an fMRI. There is a scanner, an MRI, a machine, or several machines actually at UVA. we have the skills. So Marina has worked on TMS, for instance. We both have worked on fMRI before. I think Marina might have worked on rats or mice for TMS, but what's the difference between a human and a rat? I mean, not that much. No, but so seriously, there is we could do it. The only problem is, of course, so you need to buy the machine, the TMS, and for the fMRI, it's much more costly. So we have the EEG, and now for us to use the EEG and the FNIRS, this is free because it's our machines. To use an fMRI, to do an fMRI, it costs quite a lot of money, several hundreds of dollars per hour of usage. So that quickly increases the cost. But we could do things. There are actually interesting things to do in TMS, and fMRI is very complementary to EEG and FNIRS. The difficulty with fMRI is that it's not very participant friendly. So what I said about the EEG and the FNIRS, it's very minimally invasive. We just put a cap on, a bit of preparation in a few minutes, maybe half an hour, grand max, the participant's ready. And it's quiet, it's very safe. The fMRI is super noisy. So for people to get into an altered state, it can be quite complicated. People have to lie down. It's a bit less safe as well because you basically inside a big magnet, and it's more costly. So fMRI is a great tool. It provides great information, but it's also very cumbersome logistically as well. We're not on site. The fMRI is on a different site, so it's a bit more complicated. But definitely, I mean, if have funding, I'd be very happy to include fMRI within my research. Yes.
Okay, great. We have a question here about PK testing. DOPS has done that in the past. Is that going to continue?
I don't have specific PK projects at the moment. I know that Ross is currently writing a paper on that. Ross is interested in developing PK sensors in particular. I mean, I'm open to it. I'm interested in macro PK because that's what's observed in life. So you can talk about the spoon bendings or the poltergeist. This is closer to the. I'm a proponent of ecological validity, right? So my approach is to try and stick as close as possible to the naturally occurring phenomenon. So when we have participants that can do remote viewing, the starting point, or an out-of-body experience, the starting point is how do they get there? What do they need to generate that experience? And then how can they slightly adapt? How can they modify a bit what they're doing so that it fits within the constraints of an experimental design, right? Because we have our own constraint. We can't do whatever, and we have specific questions we may want to ask, and that will guide the way we want to do things. But we also want to stay as close as possible to the original phenomenon, because if we're too rigid in our design, then that might kill the effect, right? So in PK, the naturally occurring PK is what psychic healing and spoon bending maybe and poltergeist, but not so much micro PK. People don't influence electronic noise in general. I mean, there are cases of people who disrupt computers. That's for sure. That has been reported. That's for sure. But yeah, so I would be quite interested in studying PK, but starting from the real cases and then trying to adapt those cases to an experimental paradigm. But studying macro PK is very complicated because it's very difficult to control a complex physical system, right? So the pair lab had a macro. It was a interesting design. I don't have a picture here, but you can look for it. It's the pinball machine at the pear lab. Pear, like the fruits. It was nicknamed Murphy. They had a machine with balls falling down, and and so it was, I think, 10,000 balls, and when they fall, they generate a bell-shaped curve, or a Gaussian curve. And participants were asked to influence the curve, so either to the left or to the right, or to make it wider or thinner. So this is an example of a macro PK experiment. Yes and no, because it's still very statistical. It's over many repetitions. You don't really observe the phenomenon as it happens. But yeah, so sorry, it was a long answer without really a clear answer.
No, I think that's great. I think that was really, I think several people were interested in that. So that was great. Okay, this is a kind of a mixture of a few people, and I think it's sort of all in the same vein, but can you talk about how psi experiences are related to NDEs, mediumship, and children who remember past lives? What's the through line there?
Yeah, so during NDEs, people may report events that that happen while they have the NDE, and they shouldn't have this information, right? Bruce, if you listen to his interviews, reports such cases, and those would be an ESP case within an NDE, right? Within this taxonomy of ESP PK. A court case. So you could interpret a court case. So the court, meaning the children remember past life cases. You could have the interpretation, and some people interpret it that way, of the super psi interpretation. So it is not. It would not. So if the case is real, or it's a solved case, it would not be a reincarnation of a spirit, but it would be the child somehow getting information from the past and embodying that information into memories and behaviors. So that's the super psi hypothesis of the children remember past life memories. This view has problems or limitations, let's say, but it is a view. And the other question was what? Mediumship. So when people go into a trance, they may consider that they're in connection with spirits, and they get information from the spirits. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is that they think that they're talking to spirits, and through that sort of imagined spirit, let's say, they get information, real information, through psi means. The spirit is just a visualization, or a way to generate the psi effects, let's say. So the psi is the transfer of information, or the influence of on events that can occur during those different experiences. So the mediumship experience, the NDE, and yeah, for the court, it would be maybe an interpretation of the case.
Right. Well, on that note, we are at time. I'm gonna mention a few things before we close out. First of all, this has been recorded, and all registrants will receive a recording. You can email us at DOPS, DOPS, at uvahealth.org with more questions. That's in the chat if you need that email address. If we did not get time to address your question, please reach out and we'll get back to you. We also encourage you to sign up for our bi-monthly e-newsletter. We have a link in the chat for that if you want to see what's going on, what we're all up to. And, you know, DOPS is fully donor supported. So if you are intrigued by this and want this to continue and want to support, we would absolutely love that. Every bit helps us continue to do this work. And there's a link in the chat for that as well. I want to thank everyone for coming, and thank you so much, Dr. Acunzo, for speaking with us tonight. This has been really fascinating, and I can just tell by all the questions, and people are so interested, and it's just great to be able to connect with our audience and people who love what we do. So thank you for that. And just feel free to email us with your question if it wasn't answered live. Maggie has put some links in the chat for you guys. And I think with that, we are going to sign off. Anything else, David? Did I forget anything?
Yeah, no, that's great. So yeah, so you can see the different projects that we have. Also, if you're a student and you'd like to contribute to the research, or if you're a grad student or postdoc and you want to apply for money for a research project and come to work with us, we're always looking for bright people to contribute to the research. So if that interests you, do reach out. And if you have a lot of money and you don't know what to do with money and you want to help us, you can help us with those for those projects. If you find anything like that interesting, you can reach out as well to Maggie. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. And yeah, I hope you learned a few things and had a good time. And thank you, Melanie, for hosting.
Of course. Well, thanks, everyone. We're going to go ahead and stop the recording, and we're going to sign off. Thank you so much. Good night.
Bye.